I'm Bryan Caplan, author of Build Baby Build, The Science and Ethics of Housing Regulation. And I'm here today with Michael Manville, professor of urban planning at the University of California at Los Angeles. Thank you very much for joining me, Michael.
It's a pleasure to be here, and congrats on getting the book out.
Thank you. So your research was a big input into the book. I'll confess that I've already done a lot of work on public opinion, so I never expected that objective self-interest would be all that important for people's views on housing policy. But you've added a lot of additional details. Could you talk about some of the highlights of your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think, excuse me, you're right in one sense, right? Which is that it's not just a matter. I think that the standard story that we often hear is, well, the homeowners, they fight new housing development because they're worried that it's going to depress their property values. And I don't think that never happens. And I think probably to give that theory its full credence, that idea probably best explains the type of situation where you live in a neighborhood of single-family homes, and one unit or one parcel across the street from you, a developer has applied for a variance to build an apartment building, right? It's just going to be one apartment, everything else will be single-family homes. And there you could have, I think, in its full glory, what we might call the home voter hypothesis, this great
Yes,
idea.
Bill Official.
Yeah, a wonderful book that I think everyone should read. I think that does happen quite a bit, right? Like the request for the variance. I think in that situation, a risk-averse homeowner could say, I don't know, like it's going to cast shade, it's going to devalue my property. I don't want them to grant this.
Although even there's something pretty weird about it, because if it's really just about maintaining your property values, the fact that it's across the street from you wouldn't be the main thing. It would be, well, like, how much is it going to affect property values? You should be much more worried about building 5,000 units a mile away from you than about one unit being built across the street. But almost all actual activity by homeowners seems to be this very narrow thing of, I don't want to look at it, which is pretty different actually from an actual self-interest story.
I think that's right, or at the very least, a pecuniary self-interest story, right?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
So I think
that's why I say objective self-interest. You can say everything is self-interest if it interests yourself, but then it's so tautological that who cares?
That yes, I completely agree with that. So I guess the way I would put it is that you get closest to that story with the variance, but it still does have some holes. But I think there's and in a different research I've done with different colleagues, strongly suggests that what's going on is much more, for lack of a better term, kind of psychological. That
it's a good term. I like it.
Yeah, it's a good term. That we do have, all of us, I think, have this pretty ingrained resistance or suspicion of change, and that seems to be particularly strong in the places where we live. And we invest in our neighborhood and our home a lot of meaning, and we get upset when it's going to change, and then we end up just sort of assigning various bad outcomes to sort of justify that instinctive reaction.
Yeah,
and so those could be like, oh, it's going to ruin traffic, it's going to bring down my values, it's going to bring the wrong kind of people in. And
what's really striking to me is how people almost never think about anything good that might happen if you bring in some new people. I mean, there was a very large development that happened right next to me, and there was some noise, and I didn't like it. And they cut down some trees, and then I could see the highway. The whole time I'm saying, look, if one family with one kid that my kids get along with moves in, then they got a friend within walking distance. That more than cancels out all this bad stuff. And when I say this, people look at me like I'm crazy. It's like, it's not crazy. This is a realistic scenario. It hasn't happened yet, but it could.
Yeah, and I think the folks who work in like what we now call the pro-housing or YIMBY movement, one of their most common talking points, especially at meetings, is, hey, like, you're going to get a bunch of new neighbors. Like, do you like your current neighbors? Because, like, here's more of them. Now, if you're a total misanthrope and you just say, well, I hate all my neighbors, well, it's not that persuasive. But I do think it's true. And I suppose you could say that this is a kind of a loss aversion thing where we weight these potential losses much more.
Yeah, status quo bias. I mean, I'm very fond of just using the word paranoia. When I've just heard people just go and say, what's going to happen? And they give the worst case scenario as if it is likely. It's like, look, we can imagine it being that bad, but It probably won't be.
It probably won't be. And I think I think you and I have talked about this before, one great piece of evidence to the effect that it won't be that bad is that almost every neighborhood in America has some houses that when they were proposed or built, people freaked out over them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And you, if you went back and looked, you would see that there were meetings and people were up in arms and they were saying terrible things. And then, give it 5 years, 10 years,
Yeah.
you walk through that neighborhood and people don't even notice.
Yeah.
Give
Yeah.
it 20
Hedonic
years.
adaptation is very strong.
Yeah, give it 20 or 30 years, and that same house would probably be like a source of protection, right? If someone
Yes. Yeah.
proposed tearing
Historic
it down,
preservation. Yeah.
yeah, they'd be
You
like,
got to
no, you
preserve the
can't.
thing
This
that
is
I
part
didn't
of,
want you to build in the first
yeah,
place.
it's part of the neighborhood. It's one of the most ironic attributes of the sort of, the neighborhood defender movement. It's this nice phrase that Kate Einstein uses to sort of replace NIMBY, is just that they are often defending things that their intellectual forebears objected to. The brownstones in Brooklyn, the three-deckers in Boston, the bungalows in Seattle. Like people hated those when they were proposed. But we're
The Eiffel Tower, right?
The Eiffel Tower. Yeah,
yeah. Eiffel Tower was not a popular idea.
yeah. I mean, so these are things that we're very imperfect prophets of what's going to really fit into our community, but we don't realize that at the moment because we just, instinctively we worry about change. We worry about changes to where we are, and that sort of feeds itself. And I think the point that you make in the book, or one of the great points of the book, is that that impulse is sort of just, it's in us and it's longstanding. But we have over the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st, we've given it regulatory
It's
strength.
been unleashed. We've unleashed the beast.
Yeah. I mean, it used to be that new housing was sort of, and I'm simplifying a little bit, it was a lamentable but unavoidable. Somebody, I wish they weren't like taking down those trees and putting up that building, and people were like, yeah, but like it's going to happen. And now you can stop it, right? And then that builds on itself.
All right, so let's finish up by talking about your favorite paper of mine. It's the one where you either did or did not mention to people about a hypothetical housing project that the developers would make a lot of money. Yeah. Can you tell us a bit more about it and then explain what it means?
Yeah, so this was my colleague Pavel Monkanen and I mean, we had been doing some other kind of public opinion-based work, and one of the things we realized was that the typical conception of NIMBYism, which I think is accurate, is it's this collective action problem that arises because people are worried about, as we've just discussed, some loss they'll suffer if new housing goes in to their community, to their property value, whatever it may be. But then we kind of thought, well, the other aspect of it is that people really just hate developers.
Yeah.
Right? And so it may have less to do with the product than the producer. And this is, to go to your point, is fundamentally irrational because housing is such a long-lived good that the house is going to last well past the developer. And so
it's like you don't hate farmers. Why do you hate developers? Like someone's got to do this job. Why not them?
Someone's got to do it, but it is out there. And as we talk about in the paper, there's just, maybe only attorneys, right, have this kind of, the negative stereotype that floats around them. And we sort of talk a little bit about the sheer number of movies that have the developer as a villain, right? And so we tested it with a survey experiment where we gave people, and I won't go into all the details, just a basic sort of, hey, this is the development that's being proposed in your community, and then we varied that slightly, randomly with different folks. And in the description, one frame sort of emphasized, well, the opponents don't like the traffic, and one said, oh, the opponents say it's gonna, cast shade or something. But one of them was the opponents. This is not the exact wording. The opponents don't like this because the developer is going to make a large profit off it. And we expected something from this, right? I mean, we're researchers, we wouldn't put it in otherwise.
It was what, like 20 or 30 percentage point
It
shift?
was big. It was the biggest change. And so it really did sort of make us think that there's more to it than just, I'm worried about the character of my neighborhood. There's also a sort of a resentment of the developer gaining, right? And that, of course, I suppose you could trace that back. It's sort of, Hayek writes about that in The Fatal Conceit, right? It's not just sort of fairness in terms of like what's happening to me. It's also this community norm about, should this guy be making money? But, as long as that is a powerful uh, response to housing development, I mean, it's a real problem because somebody does have to build this stuff. And, they're not going to build it if they can't make any money. And it really, to your point, it really is a kind of singular distaste. I mean, you mentioned farmers, but you could get closer to home, which is to say, if this really did repel you, you would object when your neighbor sold their house during a housing crisis and made a big windfall.
They're regular people.
They're regular people, right? They're
Developers.
not evil developers. And I think that's like, if you don't like a producer of housing, then you should also not like a producer of housing services, which is what a single family homeowner is. And they're making the money without even adding to the housing supply.
And what really strikes me is that in a system where you have to go through piles of regulation, multiple levels of regulatory approval, all this paperwork, it's in that environment where if developers couldn't make a killing if they finally got permission, then who would bother? That's the key thing, is that we've created a system where if you can navigate the entire system, there's this giant bag of gold waiting for you at the end of the rainbow. But
yeah,
if we were actually to go and squeeze out that profit, then it's like, well, probably nothing would get built if it was just some regular schmo trying to work its way through the system. Who has the patience to go through all this?
That's right. I mean, the developer was nowhere near as sinister of a figure back when a general contractor could take a loan out on his own house and throw up 10 units, right? Yep. But we make this point at the end of the paper in a slightly different way, which is to say that in a regulatory environment like this, the distaste of developers becomes almost self-fulfilling, because who's going to be able to do it? It's probably a deep-pocketed person who's willing to sort of buck the community, is willing to be kind of sharp-elbowed, and at the very least, plow through all these regulations, and at the worst, like cut some corners and pay some bribes, as we see in Los Angeles. Yeah. And then it's like, well, but that's not to condone that behavior, but like you do get the developers you regulate for.
All right. Well, fantastic talking to you, Michael. Thanks again for doing all this research, which when I'm writing this book and thinking like all this fantastic research, it's fascinating, it's interesting, like it's on big questions, and yet as long as it stays in the journals, who's going to read it? So it was my privilege to be able to take some of the work you're doing and bring it to a bigger audience, I hope. So
well, I appreciate it. And again, I just appreciate all of your efforts at making all this stuff more accessible, including Build Baby Build.
All right. Thanks a lot, Michael. Great talking to you.
Likewise.